We have a little tinkle bell this morning. Thank you all for coming. We're going to be having a beautiful day ahead of us with the conference continuing today and tomorrow. A great start last night. My name is Professor Jerry McGill, and I'm the chair of the conference committee. I want to give you a few welcoming remarks, a few explanations. But before I do that, I want to welcome President Doherty to say a few words about our conference.
Thank you, Professor McGill, and thank you all for joining us. A lot of you know us as Duquesne University. That's a nickname. Our full name is Duquesne University of the Holy Spirit, and we are sponsored by a religious community called Spiritans. And some of them are here with us this morning, some local, some from Ireland, one from Rome. And so we're glad to have an opportunity to stress that publicly, because when the Spiritans summarize briefly what they stand for, they say justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. Now, even though we could fight all day about what justice means, and we could fight all day about what peace means, we have a kind of intuitive understanding that we kind of understand those words. Less clear to everybody is the integrity of creation. So we have decided that our contribution as a Spiritan University will be to shed light on what that means by a scholarly conference every year that brings in the best thinkers around that topic for a dialogue, a conversation, words that the Pope in his recent visit emphasized again and again. Let's have a conversation about these issues. And to make sure that it is an indefinite conference, we put money aside so that every year there will be funding, so that you can count on this. We are calling it the inaugural, but you can count on this being done next year, the year after that, the year after that, and again, a conversation that we hope will be long and will come to be increasingly important. So thank you for helping us kick this off, and I hope you will help spread the word about the good things that are happening here at Duquesne University of the Holy Spirit.
President Doherty is himself a scholar, very well published with the best prices in the world. He is a scholar president, a president for scholars, and by establishing an endowment to fund this conference in perpetuity is just a wonderful tribute to his leadership and a great joy to our work. So thank you, President Doherty. I'm going to give you a few announcements, first of all. This is a green conference, so one of the very few published things we have is your little bookmark with a brief scheduling on the back. If you go on the website, you'll be able to download to your smartphones the detailed schedule. It's a PDF schedule. It's on the tab at Schedule on the website. We're trying to be a very green conference. My special gratitude to Professor Robert Schroof from the Business School. He was able to calculate and offset totally the carbon costs for this conference. So thank you very much, Professor Schroof. This is a carbon neutral conference. We have a bundle of high school students arriving, so the leaders of the future are joining us. Thank you very much, Holy Family teachers, for organizing this so well. Now, some of you may have come and parked in the Forbes garage. There is a reduced parking rate of only $5. So when you leave for that parking rate, do not use the parking machine. Just drive out, take your ticket, give it to the attendant, and say you were at the climate change conference. It really is a pleasure and a joy to have you here. This is a university. We work in university time and schedule, so people move in and out all day long. So understand with a little bit of patience that people just have to go for various reasons. It's my joy now to introduce our second plenary speaker in the conference. And to have that introduction, let me introduce Dean Phil Reeder from the Bayer School of Natural and Environmental Sciences.
Good morning, everybody. Our plenary speaker, Dr. Robert Brinkman, is Director of Sustainability Studies and Research at the National Center for Suburban Studies at Hofstra University, where he's also a professor in the Department of Geology, Environment, and Sustainability. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Geology in his home state of Wisconsin from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. He received an MS degree in Geology from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and a PhD in Geography from UWM, where his dissertation was titled Lead Pollution in Soils of Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. In 1990, he became an assistant professor at the University of South Florida, where he conducted research on sustainability issues associated with soil and sediment pollution in urban and suburban areas, as well as research on caves and karst landscapes. He has published numerous articles and books, including the only book on the science, policy, and management of urban street sweeping, and the only book on sinkholes in Florida. At USF, he was the founding chair of the Department of Environmental Science and Policy. He also served as the chair of the Department of Geography and was the Associate Dean for Faculty Development. He arrived at Hofstra University in 2011 to start a new sustainability studies program, which has evolved into the program that now offers a BS degree, a BA degree, and an MA degree in sustainability. As part of the curriculum development for these degree programs, he created courses in urban and suburban sustainability, management, wetlands, and community-based sustainability. He's currently involved in a number of projects, including analysis of sustainability efforts in post-Hurricane Sandy Long Island, evaluation of international sustainability planning in the United Nations, and the assessment of sustainability in Hainan, China. He's also active with economic development issues on Long Island and is part of the writing team of the Long Island Regional Economic Development Council, which has written the last 3 economic development plans for that region. Lastly, his blog, titled On the Brink, focuses on environmental and sustainability issues, and it gets thousands of hits daily. His forthcoming book, Sustainability, Environment, Equity, and Economics, which is being published by John Wiley & Sons, will be out later this year. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bob Brinkman.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Dr. Reeder. It's great to see all of you here. Thank you, President Doherty, for this wonderful conference, and thank you to the Planning Committee for inviting me here. I just want to thank everyone for watching online. I know that there's an audience out there. I want to recognize you and say good morning, and good morning to all of you in the audience. Thank you all for being here. We are at a time of global crisis, but before we get too serious about that, it's a long day talking about global crisis. I think it's important to bring in a little levity to the conversation. So I want to tell you a little story. About 2 years ago, I spent a summer at Oxford University in England. And while there, I met many great thinkers, and I had the opportunity to interact with many individuals who were thinking great things. And one of the individuals I met was a scholar on the early texts of the Reformation. He knew his way around a library like no one I ever knew before. We ended up becoming very good friends, but there was something about him that was a challenge for me. He was a climate change denier. And so even though we were very good friends, we did have our differences. And one night, we found our way at one of the oldest pubs in the world to have some of the best beer England can produce. And after a pint or two, we started to get into a long, rambling conversation about climate change. And I'm sorry to admit that our voices might have gotten a little loud. And my English friend said, you and your gang of so-called scientists make the data fit whatever you want to fit. And I countered him and said that he didn't understand science. And we went around like this for some time before a bartender came over and told us to quiet down. We apologized and then thought, wait a second, this is Oxford. It's a good place for a debate. So we asked the bartender to come back and asked him if he would evaluate our arguments. And this worked out pretty well because it turns out he was reading for law. So I went first and I explained how long-term climate change works. And I explained climate monitoring and the scientific link between greenhouse gases and global temperature change. I reviewed the chemistry of the atmosphere and discussed how the atmosphere impacts global temperature and weather. I covered everything from ocean acidification to carbon cycling. My friend then gave his argument and stated that temperature was always in flux, that the weather is always changing, and we've been keeping records for such a short amount of time, how could we be sure? He stated that there is no link between greenhouse gases and climate change, and that climate scientists were making up the data to get grants. So after listening to us, the bartender asked us to rebut each other's arguments, and we did so in rhetoric that you can imagine. And the bartender then said, well, here's what I'll do. I'll give the best drink in the house to the person who I think won, and I'll give the worst drink in the house to the person who lost the argument. And so he then proceeded to make the most extravagant drink either of us had ever seen. He first juiced half an orange and poured that into a glass, and then he added pineapple and passion fruit juice, along with some coconut milk and some simple syrup. Finally, he reached all the way to the top of the top shelf to grab the best rum in the house and poured that into the glass. And he topped it all off with a dramatic garnish of pineapple and cherries. Then he grabbed a dusty mug from a drying rack above the bar and poured a pint of ale in a glass. My friend and I wondered who was going to get that fancy drink and who was going to get the beer. Well, when he had both drinks ready, he put the fancy drink in front of my friend and the beer in front of me. Aha, my friend said, I see my argument won the day. Not so fast, the bartender said. Your mate had the best argument by far. What do you mean, my friend said. I got that fancy cocktail. And the bartender said, well, that's true, but everybody knows that the best drink in a British pub is a pint of ale. Well, and then my friend said, well, what did you give me? And the bartender said, I gave you a hurricane without ice. All right. Well, you know, I exaggerated just a little bit with that story, but it highlights one of the main challenges in my talk. How do we get along as we try to build a more sustainable world? In my talk today, I want to focus on three main areas. First, I want to talk about the development of the new Sustainable Development Goals. They're being voted on this week at the United Nations, and the topic is particularly important, and everyone in this room should know about them. Second, I want to talk about work I did with the United Nations on assessing global sustainability management in developing countries. From there, I want to talk about the role of the developed world in the context of true global sustainability. I'll discuss the role, I'll question whether or not the developed world is an aspirational peer for the rest of the world, for developing countries. And I'll conclude by giving some hope that we can all get along and save the world in this time of crisis. So first, let's take a look at the Sustainable Development Goals. In many ways, The Sustainable Development Goals emerge out of the key UN report, Our Common Future. This is Gro Brundtland here, who is the lead author of the report. It's sometimes called the Brundtland Report, and it's the first report that highlighted the significant changes that we were seeing in the world in the 1980s as a result of globalization. It noted widespread deforestation, ecosystem disruption, social inequality, and a myriad of other problems, and many of these problems remain today. It was in this report that we get the first definition of sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the future or of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. But the document also implies that we have moved beyond an environmental focus on development and it brought in this idea of economics and equity. Well, while the report was very good at detailing the problems, it wasn't very good at detailing solutions. And that was a key flaw in the document. But in 1992, the United Nations hosted the Earth Summit. Some of you might have been there or been aware, certainly were aware of it at the time. Sometimes it's called the Rio Summit. And it was an event to try to develop key ways to address problems brought out in Our Common Future, the Brundtland Report. And it resulted in a lot of amazing outcomes, including Agenda 21, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, the Statement of Forest Principles, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, even in 1992, and the United Nations Conference on Biodiversity. Each of these agreements addressed important issues of global sustainability in different ways. For example, Agenda 21 tried to focus on taking the global agenda down to the local agenda, and eventually that local agenda split off into something some of you might be familiar with called ICLEI for local governments. Today, Agenda 21 is still in play and was reaffirmed at the Rio Plus 20 meetings, which I'll talk about in a moment. However, taken as a whole, the agreements from the Earth Summit did not comprehensively address the problems that were raised in Our Common Future. But then, in 2000, the UN adopted the Millennium Development Goals at the Millennium Summit. Now, I have to tell you, these goals evolved in a different way than from those that were developed at the Earth Summit. They evolved from offices at the United Nations that were largely involved with health, poverty, and education. So obviously, those are the centerpiece of the Millennium Development Goals. I want to take a moment to review them all. These are slides directly from the United Nations that show some of the successes and failures within each of the goals. The first goal was to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. The second goal was to achieve universal primary education. The third goal was to promote gender equality. The fourth was to reduce child mortality. The fifth was to improve maternal health. The sixth was to combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. The sixth was to ensure environmental sustainability. The seventh. And the eighth was to develop a partnership for sustainable development. So for the last 15 years, the United Nations, national governments, non-government organizations, philanthropists like Bill Gates, and a range of development experts have worked to try to improve the world around these goals. What is important to know about these goals is they all have measurable outcomes, indicators, that allow countries to compare themselves over time and allow countries to compare themselves in a region or internationally. So we could create maps or rating tables or other visualization and statistical assessments of global sustainability using one or more of these indicators. And I think that most people believe that these efforts have been successful, largely successful. Certainly not all countries have made improvements in all areas. And nevertheless, there's no doubt that real measurable progress has been made around the world. We have the people living in extreme poverty. We've seen great improvements in gender equality in schools. Millions of deaths have been avoided in HIV and malaria, and 2.1 billion people have access to improved sanitation. These are not small numbers, so this is a very successful program from my viewpoint. However, there was a problem with the Millennium Development Goals from a sustainability perspective. They only focused on issues in developing countries. Let's fast forward now to Rio Plus 20 meeting, also called the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, that occurred in 2012 in Rio as the 20th anniversary of the original Earth Summit. The main outcome of this was a report called The Future We Want. And one of the key elements of the document was the call for the development goals for new development goals called Sustainable Development Goals to replace or take over from the Millennium Development Goals. Just so you know, the Rio Plus 20 meeting was not as popular as the original Earth Summit internationally. Only 88 heads of state attended that meeting compared to 116 from the original meeting. Notable absences included many European leaders and President Obama. Many believe they did not attend due to key changes in the way that the United Nations was framing sustainable development. Some of the key ideas challenged traditional consumption and production patterns, as well as traditional ways of assessing development, such as gross national product. Uh-oh, got to restart my computer. I don't have a keyboard here. Here we go. There we go. That'll do it. So this issue of assessing whether or not what the developed world was doing on sustainability was important, and it brings out issues I addressed in an essay I wrote for the Journal of Sustainability Education with Richard Verco called A Tale of Two Sustainabilities. In it, we point out that we are really walking down two very different global paths when we talk about sustainability. In developed countries, we concern ourselves with efficiency and whether we recycle or not. We concern ourselves whether or not our events are carbon neutral, which is fantastic that it's carbon neutral. But these are the kinds of things we do in the developed world. Do we have green buildings? Are our homes solar? What is our Prius a plug-in? Whereas in the developing world, there's concern whether or not we have access to fresh drinking water. We have whether or not we have access to basic sanitation, whether we have access to food, and whether or not our families are going to be disrupted by the waves of globalization that impact poorer nations. So it's important to note that this translation of sustainability is often lost when we just generalize sustainability, that we're really talking about different kinds of development strategies. And in many ways, the traditional way we've thought about sustainability is that the developed world is providing funds and technological expertise to the developing world. And we're starting to transition into a new way of thinking about this, that we have much to learn from each other in this concept of sustainability. So since 2012, the United Nations has been focused on developing indicators within this context of the Sustainable Development Goals that brings some of these ideas together. As you'll see, they include all of the MDGs, but expand to issues that allow us to be reflexive in the developed world, and also bring in other ideas of environmental protection. I'm going to take a moment to just go through all 17. Like I said, it's an important moment this week because they are being approved. So let's go through all 17. The first one is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. The second goal is to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. The third is to improve healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. The fourth is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and to promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. The fifth is to achieve gender equality and empowerment and empower all women and girls. The sixth is to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. The seventh is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Goal 8 is to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full, productive employment, and decent work for all. Goal 9 is to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Goal 10 is to reduce inequality within and among countries. Goal 11 is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Goal 12 is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Goal 13 is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Goal 14 is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Goal 15 is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. Goal 16 is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Finally, Goal 17 is to strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. So these are the goals that are up for approval this week. As you can anticipate, each goal has many measurable outcomes. So it's a much wider and deeper examination of global sustainability. Again, that doesn't just look at the developing world. Now, you have to remember that the development of these goals was a very intensive process. Every country of the world was invited to provide input. Hundreds of NGOs, consulting firms, and state and local government officials were invited to provide commentary. Importantly, in the context of this conference, many religious organizations provided input. In addition, hundreds of experts, including myself, were asked to provide input. And related to this, after Rio Plus 20, I was contacted by the UN to do an evaluation of the status of global sustainability. They asked me to read all the sustainability plans created by every nation of the world, truly, to come up with some big picture thoughts on the status of global sustainability in order to inform the process of developing sustainable development these goals. And I read them all, along with my colleague Sandra Guerin, and we read as many different kinds of sustainable development reports as we could that were produced over the last 20 years. And what I want to tell you about the reports, and then I wanted to tell you about some of the outcomes that we found that informed the development of those goals. First of all, we read all the Rio Plus 20 reports that were produced by countries of the world. And it included a lot of different types of development strategies. Then we also read the reports from small island developing states. If you're not familiar with it, the small islands of the world have special problems different from countries in the rest of the world because of climate change, because of the impacts of globalization, because of water resource issues, tourism. We also read reports from the World Summit on Sustainable Development that occurred in 2002 in Johannesburg, which was a 10-year anniversary of the original Earth Summit. We also read all the Millennium Development Goals reports we could. And there's also reports from the Global Network of National Councils on Sustainable Development. And for countries where we couldn't find information, we did web searches to try to find out what was happening. In all, we reviewed about 300 different documents. And I also attended several UN workshops on sustainability and had the chance to network and talk with many of the people involved with sustainability initiatives in their countries. And my goal in reviewing so much of this information was not to drill down into the specific issues, but to try to get broader trends on what were the successes and challenges in implementing sustainability or the Millennium Development Goals. And while I could provide a summary of some of the strategies or innovative efforts of countries, and there are a lot of them, I wanted to talk about the challenges, what limits us to promote sustainability that would hamper the development of the new Sustainable Development Goals. And I divided those challenges into two broad areas, societal challenges and bureaucratic challenges. Let's start with the societal challenges. I've identified three main areas in the societal challenges that were brought out by the writers of these reports. They're the acceptance of sustainability in the countries, war, conflict, corruption or human rights abuses, and then finally education. So let's go through all of these. So first of all, the acceptance of sustainability. In the United States, we understand that there are certain people who buy into the idea of sustainability. I assume you're all here. And there are others who do not. We see this quite clearly in the national debate on climate policy. Sustainability issues are sometimes framed with the same dichotomy in other countries. I have to talk about the tale of two sustainabilities that I referred to before. The Western construction that focuses in on efficiency and the developing world construction that focuses in on the traditional efforts of sustainable development. But within this, some question why their countries should buy into this idea of sustainability. Some of them see it as a capitalist construction. Do they really need to privatize water to gain access to improved water quality? Do they need to purchase, here we go again, do they need to purchase Western medicines or seeds to improve healthcare or agriculture? Do they have to buy into a Western education model? While many of the educated and elite in all nations of the world buy into some of this, not everyone does. And so there's some degree of tension within nations over how sustainability is defined, implemented, and managed. And some countries have outright rejected the whole idea of sustainability, which is important to understand. Second, societal challenges. The second societal challenge is war, conflict, corruption, and human rights abuses. And while we live at a time of great peace, we also live at a time of tremendous conflict. And many nations have national governments that do not have control of the land within their borders. And it's interesting to note that many of these countries have sustainability plans. So they have the plans, but they're not necessarily able to implement it because they don't have sovereignty over their lands. Plus, some nations have been at a state of continuous war for generations. And they too have developed sustainability plans, but if you talk to the managers of them, there's no way they will ever be implemented because the national resources are going not to sustainability, but to security. Some nations also have well-known human rights abuses or are known for widespread corruption or have little regard for international law or convention. And some of these nations have sustainability plans, but there's not a lot of trust for them in the international community. How can you trust the environmental ethics of a country when the human ethical dimensions are so clearly in poor form? The next societal challenge is education. While we seek to promote education in sustainability, we also have to understand that we need an educated population in order to accept and manage sustainability initiatives. Deforestation comes to mind. It's difficult to encourage an ethic around forest resources when the short-term economic improvement beats out sound bureaucratic plans. So these three societal challenges were often highlighted in national or regional sustainability reports developed by those writers from those countries. More interestingly, a lot of these things were discussed informally with developers of the planning documents. And there's tremendous concern on these issues around the world as to whether or not any sustainability effort, global sustainability effort, will be successful unless these issues are addressed. Now let's turn our attention to the bureaucratic levels of sustainable development that I found problematic. And there are 5 of them related to national governments, evolution of institutions, and training, data, and costs. So let's take a look first at the structure of national governments. We know that governments vary around the world greatly. Some have relatively weak federal governments with strong state or local governments, and others have the reverse. In many ways, the United States system has some challenges. We have a strong federal government, but we also have strong state governments. We cannot develop strong environmental policy unless we have buy-in at all levels of the government. And the same is true in every country of the world. So how can we effectively develop a national plan that addresses sustainability goals unless there's buy-in from the local communities? And there's a lot of concern in many nations of the world that there's not buy-in from local communities in many places. Next is the evolution of institutions. For many countries of the world, this idea of sustainability is a new concept. The institutions are not in place. The bureaucratic institutions are not in place. So and we see this even at the university levels here in the United States. An Office of Sustainability at Duquesne is going to be very different from an Office of Sustainability at Hofstra. So if we were to be asked to address particular national goals, it might be difficult for one or the other to do that. And that's the case here. It's clear if you think about what happened with Ebola in the last year, where we had some nations very able to address the issues of Ebola and other nations that really were not ready bureaucratically to handle the public health issue. Training is another issue. It sounds so mundane to think about training within these international targets. But over and over again, the national reports spoke about the challenges of training people in their countries to address these concerns on sustainable development. Things like, related to this notion is whether or not we have appropriate equipment and software. So I want to give you an example. A lot of this is in the context of the developing world, but I want to talk about Long Island, where I live. We have 250 local governments on Long Island that are responsible in some way for stormwater management, collecting data, handling appropriate policy, etc. Only a handful of them keep their records electronically, and only a subset of that group puts their records online in GIS. So when we have very rich Long Island, technologically advanced society there, unable to really effectively manage stormwater and to provide that information effectively to the public, you can imagine the kinds of things that are going on around the world with training and the ability to manage things. Related to this is data. In the United States, we have a census every 10 years. Countries around the world are asked to report on sustainability indicators. It takes precious money and time of public officials around the world to do this work. And of course, related to this are the costs. Most countries have external forces that are driving them down the sustainability path. Their precious treasure is needed for things that they've prioritized within their own country, and these sustainable indicators are not necessarily their top priority for spending their money. They have choices to take funds from existing priorities or seek funds from donor countries or raise taxes, and none of these are good things to do if you are a leader of a developing world. And I think you will agree that these bureaucratic challenges, while very expensive undertakings to improve upon, are more solvable than some of the societal problems I mentioned earlier. Before turning to the final point of my talk, though, I want to highlight that even though I've pointed out all these problems, most of the world is trying to work on sustainability issues. There are earnest people in every corner of the world trying to make improvements and make the world a better place, but they're hindered by these significant social, and bureaucratic challenges I outlined. Okay, at this point I want to turn your attention to the last topic of my talk, which is on the tension in the world on sustainability outcomes. As we've seen, most of the conversation in the world, at least from an applied perspective, comes within the context of improving developing countries. We've seen that hundreds of national reports have been written on developing countries all over the world through the UN. We've also seen that these reports highlight significant social and bureaucratic challenges. Yet what about the developed world? Is our role only to be providers of knowledge and money? Are we to be the aspirational target of nations? That's a difficult question, right? I want to bring this into context within a conversation about two characters developed by Kate Mulgrew. I wrote about this in an essay in Huffington Post, that much of the rest of the world sees us as one of these two characters. We either are the Star Trek captain, full of great technology, trying to save the world through science and technology. We know what to do. We have great courage and great optimism for the future. But there's also, if you're familiar with Orange is the New Black, the character Red, who is not such a great person, right, if you know that show. She is greedy. She thinks only of herself. She is not good to other people, and it's all about her. And in many ways, the rest of the world looks at the U.S. in these lights. We do great, wonderful things, but we're also seen as very greedy. We're familiar with venture capitalists that just raised the price of drugs by 5,000% in the news. So we have two sides to us. Plus, it's worth asking if we're really green. Before coming here, I think I'm very green. I have a plug-in hybrid. I bike. I do a lot of education on sustainability. But I ran my ecological footprint at footprint.org just as I was getting on my plane. And right? And I found that here we go again, that my footprint is equivalent to 6.2 worlds. In other words, if everyone lived like me, we would need over 6 Earths to have all the resources we would need. Clearly, we're not living within ecological harmony of the world. We have an ethical dilemma facing us that is different from those that we've faced in the past. If we look closely at the development of environmental ethics, at least within the Western perspective, we see that we've evolved a lot in the last couple of centuries. In the 19th century, we had writers like Muir and Thoreau argue that nature had intrinsic value and that that nature elevated us spiritually. Muir famously said the clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness, right? So while the writings of Muir and Thoreau had tremendous influence on the way that we protected the natural lands, they were unable to protect us from the ravages of 20th century industrialization. It wasn't until we developed a new ethical framework that we were able to push back against pollution and widespread environmental devastation brought about at this time. The two writers who helped frame this were Aldo Leopold, the author of A Sand County Almanac, and Rachel Carson, author of Silent Spring, who helped helped make a case for a secular ethics based on the rules of science. Via sound environmental management, we are able to protect ourselves from the bad behavior of individuals and organizations. In the U.S., this led to the development of environmental laws like the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. But our era is different. We understand environmental science like never before. We fully understand the impacts of greenhouse gases on the atmosphere. We know where species are disappearing. We understand that there are great social and economic inequalities in the world. We understand the ravages of globalization on cultures. This has led some authors to critique where we're at. Edward Abbey, of course, made the case that governments were ineffective at dealing with environmental issues. And Bill McKibben famously wrote about the end of nature. With everything we know, why was it that we were unable to act? Clearly, we need a new discussion on environmental ethics. And I think we might be seeing it within the context of religious communities. In the early 1990s, about the time of the first Earth Summit, I was living in Florida, and I started to see the bumper sticker, WWJD. It didn't mean what would Jesus do, the name on the well-known t-shirts and bracelets that probably some in here are sporting, but it meant what would Jesus drive? Some evangelical churches in the South started to critique the evangelical prosperity gospel that was and remains popular in many communities, and were advocating for better ethics and personal behavior in the evangelical community. At the same time, many churches started to speak widely about environmental ethics and take a strong stand on consumerism and waste. The book Women Pioneers of the Louisiana Environmental Movement, which publishes the oral histories of key players in developing sound environmental policies in Louisiana in the 1980s and 1990s, show the role of religious communities, personal ethics, and corporate responsibility in this era. A very long crescendo was building through today that critiques our wasteful society. Recently, the World Council of Churches and the Episcopal Church opted to divest from fossil fuels. The Catholic Church has framed climate change as a social justice issue, most significantly in the last visit of Pope Francis. We are hearing more and more critiques of consumerism and excess. The recent outcry over the 5,000% overnight markup by that young drug investor I referred to before shows that our country may be on a tipping point on the excesses of our culture. Young people in many different religious organizations are coming together to reframe the environmental movement by stating that it is our responsibility to protect the integrity of creation. We are starting to have a more reflexive attitude about the environment as a result of this ethical discourse. How can we look away and go about our daily lives at the rate of 6 planets of consumption when the rest of the world is in the midst of destruction? That is why there's great hope that the new Sustainable Development Goals will allow all of us in the developed world to take a fresh, ethical look at our impact on our beautiful planet and on all the societies of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. We have time for a few questions. Does anybody has questions? Sir. Yeah, you. 10 minutes. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
I'm curious, I'm always a little bit concerned when I see the economic development goals. While I see that they are noble and wonderful and what a vision for the world, and you then just juxtaposed it yourself with 6 planets.
Right.
And I'm curious to know in particular the goal of economic growth. What part of the economy or what type of economy can grow when we're already at 6 planets for some of us, and globally we're, I think, at 1 point something.
Right.
So I haven't ever been able to reconcile those. I wonder if you can speak to that.
I think you're at the root of the challenge we have. There are some I didn't bring the measurable indicators to discuss today, but I think that when you look at economic development, whether it's in a developing country or an American context, there are some things that we can do. It's a matter of making important choices to drive us down a different path. Let me give you an example from Long Island, where I'm at. We are trying to encourage economic development of carbon neutral industries or technologies that promote sustainability. So it's making those different choices within the current economic model to try to turn the ship in a different direction. We're not going to change that overnight, but we have to at least try, right? Otherwise, we could give up and go into a Mad Max world, which is what some people think we're headed to, right? But I think if we work in our communities to make those little pieces of difference, we can start moving in the right way. I think economic development is a very interesting thing within sustainability. I know there's some folks from the business school here who work on those issues of sustainability and economic growth. And it's a very difficult thing, but it is doable, in my opinion.
Other questions? Yeah, right here.
So I would agree that social acceptance of sustainability is it's a big issue, not only for developing countries, but also for us in the United States. And I wonder if you have sort of a bright moment that you could share with us, maybe at Hofstra or other places that you've, collaborated with, or other governments even, where they've done something small that had a large impact on social acceptance of sustainability.
I think that there's some really good examples that come out recently within college communities. I don't know if you've been familiar with 350.org, that organization, 350.org. They've done I'm in the New York area, and we went down to the climate march, and Hofstra University had 400 people attend that march, which was we're a small university, and that was a big group that we were able to get out to that event. But when I got there, there were 400 people from Ohio, from Iowa, from Texas. Thousands of people from all over the country came out. I think the work of organizations like 350.org and other groups are very inspiring to young people, and we need to encourage them as much as possible. In terms of local governments, I have to say that there's the work. What matters, and it kind of gets to your question, the work of individuals is so important in local governments. I worked with the city of Tampa on some sustainability initiatives in poor communities. And I would say that because of one person, the poor communities of Tampa had many more sustainability initiatives than some of the wealthier communities that just don't care about it. So individuals matter. The spark of innovation and creativity matter within those organizations.
Sir, right here.
The economic development in sustainability.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to relate an experience that I had recently. I visited a nation that I represent, British Columbia,
Yeah.
New Halts Nation, and they have 85% unemployment.
Yeah.
85%. It took them 3 days to tow an Enbridge trailer out of their community because their statement to me is, Ron, our biggest inconvenience up here is when we bend down to drink from the creeks, the streams, the rivers, we have to push the salmon aside.
Right.
Now, why do we want $50,000 and $100,000 in our pockets and risk that inconvenience? And what I want to say to everyone here is that is a mindset that is not south of the border. That is a mindset that we need to develop. Otherwise, we are left to suffer the pangs of greed and no respect for our grandchildren.
I really appreciate that comment. It's an important one. I think you're right on the money. Is right now we expect so much, right, in our culture, but we can live with so much less, and it's making those choices to do with less and to not necessarily always be achieving for more wealth or for more stuff. And that's you raise a really significant issue.
Salmon is their
Yeah.
money.
Yeah.
Salmon is their local sustainability.
And that gets at the globalization issue. I related to that paper with Richard Verco. He was relating to the salmon community in Chile that was dependent on salmon that was impacted by globalization, where they lost it to globalized fishing markets. So, yeah.
Other questions? Sir, right here.
You mentioned in your talk, thank you, it's a great talk, appreciate it, in that the the 1992 or the 2000 development goals, 116 heads of state attended. Rio plus 20, 88 heads of state. And then you said that there were some consumption and economic issues that, for instance, the White House, I've gathered the Obama administration didn't attend. Those development goals seem pretty reasonable, rational. And what is the consumption problem? Do you have any insight as to what was the objection to what was in those goals?
There were objections to the framing of sustainability as, many countries were very critical at Rio Plus 20 of the consumption patterns of the West. And it was out in the pre-documents. There were many written critiques of capitalism. There were many written critiques of particular economic models. And it made a lot of countries very uncomfortable. And that's, in my opinion, that's why they did not attend. Even though at the same time, if you recall when it happened, it was right at the start of the economic crisis. And many world leaders said that that's why they didn't attend. But they were signaling they weren't attending in advance of the economic crisis anyways.
Do you have any sense at high levels that there is question about infinite growth on a finite planet? That there is really any questioning of capitalism in its current form?
I do. I think that there are conversations over how much longer certain things can keep going. I think that there's a larger question on how capitalism is being redefined through changes in large global economic policy and national policy, capitalism tinkering with monetary issues is starting to happen. We heard a little bit about this last night with conversations around carbon taxation, things like that. And that's more where the conversation is going, at least in the developed world, or in the capitalist world, I should say.
Right here.
Yeah. Excellent.
You mentioned that one of the challenges is that we don't have accessibility to data and how we are measuring the indicators. So if I base my facts on my findings on the GER indicators, I see that they are doing a lot of reporting but not actionable takeaways.
Right.
So if you have any recommendation on what can be done to make it more actionable, what would that be?
Yeah, that issue came out in a lot of conversations with sustainability managers around the world. If any of you are familiar with planning offices or how planning's done, we often develop community plans that are aspirational. And in many ways, these national sustainability plans are aspirational targets. And they produce data that may or may not be utilized. And I think that there's a sense internationally that the data are not being used as effectively as they could to implement real strategies. And I think a large reason for that is, again, because of this lack of local acceptance of sustainability in many nations, or the inability of national governments to have networks in local communities to push some of this stuff down. We see it in our country quite a bit. We are one of the few developed nations in the world without a sustainability plan. We don't have an Office of Sustainability. If you look at how the U.S. government manages it, it's very limited. We have energy plans and we might have transportation plans, but we don't have a comprehensive vision. So the real leadership in the United States is actually at the state and local level on sustainability. Pittsburgh is one of the leading voices at the city level. New York City is another one. And they're leading the way at the local level. And that's happening to a certain extent around the world, but at the same time when reporting happens, it's at the national level that may or may not be tied in that closely with local communities.
We'll do one more question, and then Dr. Brinkman will be available at break time for a one-on-one or group discussion. One more question?
There's three in the back.
Yeah, start back here.
So representing the Holy Family Academy, my question would be, I've got about 100 young people, not all of them are here. What advice would you give to them
Well, what a great question. Thank you for that. And I'm so glad that you are all here. You are the people who will change the world. The one thing you have to recognize is that the local matters and that you should try to change your school, your families, and yourselves as you work along the way. There are many people here at Duquesne, and many of them here, who are working hard to make Duquesne a greener university. You have a carbon-free conference. How wonderful is that? That's an amazing thing. What can you do in your school to move to a more carbon-neutral school? And as you get older, think about the choices that you are making so that you have to recognize that when you buy things that are made all over the world, that impacts those places. Think about how your choices matter as you move forward. Ethics is not just about the day-to-day lives. It's also about what you buy and what the decisions you make on how you live. So think about those. Try to live a softer life on the planet. In terms of what the school can do, I urge the school to have a sustainability committee to work on sustainability issues that brings together administrators, students, and faculty to develop targets for the school and to develop events that educate the rest of the school about sustainability issues, and find a partner around the world in a developing country that you could Skype in at and talk about how your communities impact each other, so you can hear the voices of kids your age from countries that are very different from ours. That's what I would do.
Let's thank Dr. Brinkman one more time. Thank you.
That was wonderful. A few housekeeping issues before we go. We're having a little break over the next few moments, and at break time you're going to hear Tinkle Bell, which tells you to move to the next item. After the break, there are 2 breakout sessions. One is going to be here, and the other one is going to be next door. And if you look at your PDF schedule, you'll see the options. In each of these breakout sessions, there's going to be a couple of papers, and that will go on for an hour. So we've had the plenary presentation this morning. We have the breakout presentation coming up. And then at the end of the morning session is a really important event. It is completely dedicated to conversation between the tables, between each other. I will facilitate the event. So we've designed each morning and afternoon segment to have a full hour session dedicated to conversation among yourselves, to inspire one another with the insights that we have in addition to the papers that we're hearing. Finally, as you know, we are streaming this conference live. We have a global audience. It's wonderful to have that. And in particular to know that even after the event, this is all being recorded so that people will be able to access all of the papers online at any future time. So have a little break, and I'll have you tinkle bell in about 20 minutes to move you to the next event. Thank you all. Coffee's out in the hall.